Can you even see me over the podium? Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining us on the second day of the Clark Conference, Ecologies, Agents, Terrains. And I think the theme of this panel will interest everyone greatly given our discussion yesterday. Our three papers will all consider the topic of matter. Our first speaker today is Sonya Lee, Associate Professor of Chinese Art and Visual Culture at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. Today she'll be sharing her talk, An Eco-Art History of Weathered Stone Sculptures from Southwest China. Please join me in welcoming Sonya Lee.
Well, thank you for coming. Before I begin, I would like to thank Rebecca and Chris and all the wonderful staff at Clark for putting up this fantastic symposium. It is tantalizing to look at weathered stone sculptures. The work on the screen exemplifies some of the challenges that we face when trying to make sense of something like this. What you're looking at is a high relief sculpture in a small niche. So what you're looking at here comes from a larger composition that's been carved onto this much larger cliff face, located at a Buddhist devotional site called Beishan in southwest China. It shows a bow-headed monk figure in a long flowing robe, standing on a pedestal with a back head halo side by side with another figure of equal size, both surrounded by 10 groups of smaller figures on the side walls. The statue remains in good enough shape for us to discern its iconographic identity and appreciate its aesthetic appeal. At the same time, the many signs of deterioration we can readily detect in its physical form do evoke a sense of loss, prompting us to wonder how glorious this figure might have once appeared when first completed, and how much it has been diminished under the relentlessness of the elements and the passage of time. With this brief introduction of what a viewer's first encounter with a weathered stone sculpture might entail today, I would like to introduce two distinct modes of looking pertaining to the study of these works. First, which is primarily favored by art historians, is concerned with gleaning information from the sculpture as part of a broader attempt at interpreting the past through material culture. Accordingly, the kind of information useful for this purpose pertains to the work's style, iconography, function, and placement within the larger setting, as well as the cultural meanings attached to it by its patrons, makers, and viewers. So in case you're wondering what we're looking at, the sculpture I've been highlighting here is the Bodhisattva Kshitigarbha, a Buddhist deity specializing in rescuing sentient beings from hell, and it also marks the introduction of the concept of purgatory in China through Buddhism. Now, let me turn to the second mode, which is associated mainly with conservators, who concentrate on the work's physical conditions and the factors that have contributed to its deterioration over time. So this is a quick summary of some of the problems that a stone conservator will be able to pick out with this example. The two modes of looking that I have just described are deeply ingrained in their respective disciplines, namely art history and conservation. This is not a surprise, considering that there is plenty of information for each group to mine when dealing with a fairly well-preserved work like the Kshitigarbha Bodhisattva. But the need to rethink the value of the approach that each group represents becomes apparent when we turn to examples that defy expectations. The two sculptures here on the screen, both from the same site, Beishan, illustrate well the neglect they have suffered in art historical scholarship. I myself was guilty of ignoring well-worn objects like these early on in my career, as I tended to focus instead on better preserved works to carry out historical interpretations about the making of Buddha's images in China, as understood through their iconography, style, and patronage. My lack of interest in weathered stone sculptures more fundamentally, had to do with a tendency shared by many art historians to project the subject of our study as something arrested in a particular point in time and space. Accordingly, Weatherstone sculptures do not quite fit into this paradigm because their original appearance has already been compromised. In the past several years, as I devoted myself increasingly to pursuing an Earth-centered approach in art history through my work on cave temples in Southwest China, I began to realize that Weatherstone sculptures are in fact an invaluable resource on the complex relationship between art and nature. But in order to tap into the topic's potential, a major methodological reconsideration is in order. Today's paper grew out of this larger project to develop an eco-art history of Weatherstone sculptures, drawing particularly on specimens from Southwest China. The basic premise on which to launch the discussion is the need to bring art history and heritage conservation together so that we can better understand what these objects can tell us about the ecological context of which they are part, as well as the mindset and practice that the human caretakers have brought to the maintenance of these objects in responding to the changes in the environment. Accordingly, the first step toward making this shift from art history to eco-art history is to embrace a change in the way we conceptualize the subject of our research, namely as a work frozen in time and space to one that is constantly changing. By making the passage of time a focus in my analysis, I emphasize the importance of considering those factors that contributed to the changes in the sculpture's material state through time, and the subsequent interventions made to restore the object's function and thereby extend its lifespan. Conservation science proves to be useful for providing critical information on which art historians can base further studies of these aspects. At the same time, applying the historical lens to the treatment of Weatherstone sculptures can help historicize conservation practices in modern times, thereby affording us the long view needed to understand today's techniques and methods in relation to those from the past. For the rest of my talk, I plan to demonstrate more concretely what an eco-art history of Weatherstone sculptures might entail and how it could help illuminate the way people in a specific cultural and ecological context have responded to nature through the creation and preservation of material objects. To this end, my analysis will concentrate mostly on one site, Beishan, a Buddhist cave temple complex located in the Dazhu district of Chongqing. After a brief introduction to the site and its setting, I will discuss different types of deterioration commonly found at that site. Since my goal here is historical rather than scientific, my analysis is not about proposing any treatment method or advancing our knowledge of stone deterioration. Rather, it is about understanding Weatherstone sculptures in relation to the kinds of ecological conditions at work in the setting, and the interventions made both in the past and present to preserve these works in such a context. In the case of the Dazhu materials, I'm particularly interested in explaining the remarkable transformation in cave design that occurred between 9th, 10th century and the 12th, 13th century, which can very quickly be summed up in these two slides. So I am very interested in the change in the format that you notice in these two separate examples. I believe that the change was made possible by significant advances in the technology of cave building as builders and carvers became more daring in their attempts at creating monumental sculptures on mountain cliff faces. So let me now turn to the geography, just a bit information about the site itself. Dazhu district is one of the major centers of Buddhist material culture in China, as you can see in the big map. It's located in southwestern part of China in a special administrative region called Chongqing, which was established in 1997. Before that, it was part of the Sichuan province. So Dazhu is an administrative district within Chongqing, and Beishan is a site within that. So there are over 50,000 extant pictorial images distributed across more than 40 cave complexes in Dazhu. That's why it's one of the most important regions for the study of Buddha's material culture. Beishan, literally meaning the northern mountain, is one of the most important sites in the area, due in part to its close proximity to the county seat. As you can see, it's located just right outside the city center. And also for the existence of some of the earliest images made in the area, which dates to as early as the late 9th century. Pictorial images at Beishan are mostly relief carvings on cliff faces, organized in discrete compositions that fill up the interior of shallow rectangular niches, like you see on the screen. There are a few large excavated spaces that extend deep into the rock with life-size statues set up inside in stage-like assemblages. So you have these niches, and you also have these much larger spaces. The majority of the niches, 252 in total, are located near the top of the hill, which is about 1,800 feet above sea level. So it's not a very big mountain, but it's not small either. And all the carvings are located across several large cliff faces at the very top and on the same level. Today, all these pictorial niches are now sheltered in a large wooden frame structure, which was first erected in the 1950s by the local management unit. The well-kept appearance of the structure and all the fancy monitoring equipment that you see in this image here tells you that the site is one of the top priority protected cultural heritage sites in China. That's why they're extremely well funded, and the people managing the sites are serious about its conservation. Now let's turn to the surrounding area with these photographs, which shows you a fairly lush landscape full of trees and plants. And here I have a picture showing you the kind of stone that you see exposed in different parts as you walk up the hill to the top. It is, to be sure, a very humid, hot environment with average annual rainfall close to 40 inches. So that's a lot. And also a yearly relative humidity at 85%. So just for comparison, I looked up the same information for Albany, New York, just for comparison, and in Albany, there's about 38 inches of rain every year, and the relative humidity is about 70%. So as you can see, Dazhu is a lot wetter and more humid than even in New York State or in Williamstown. Now I'm turning to this slide, which shows you the many different types of deterioration evident in the Kishidi Barber niche. So as you can see on the screen, they include delamination, missing parts, subfluorescence, erosion, biological colonization, and scaling flaking. As it turns out, all these damages are common throughout the entire site. What is worth pointing out is that many are caused either directly or indirectly by the presence of water and salt in the stones. So I will begin with a brief discussion about biological colonization, which is actually an important indicator of high water content in the stone. The appearance of algae, moss, and mold on stone surfaces reveals a situation in which the substrate remains moistened for long periods of time. If we look around, this problem is pervasive throughout the entire site. So this is the niche that I've been showing you, and so as you may recall from the previous slide, there's quite a lot of biodeterioration in this area, but if you look around, all the area where I have red arrows point to the same problem. And if you look just further, just going this way, then you see more in the lower part of all these niches in the lower part. And if we turn to the bigger composition, and you can see that it's at the bottom. And here's actually interesting because it shows you the depth of this area, and you can see that the biodeterioration is evident pretty much throughout this entire area. And if we go to other sections, even the deeply excavated spaces, you can see that moisture continues to be a problem further inside the niches. So we've been looking at this area, so I'm just going a little bit further the other direction where these deeper niches are located. And you can see the moisture inside. And in this particular slide, which is a detail of this, on one humid day, a day with no rain, water actually zips out from the ground. And so you can see traces of that. Now let me show you one of the biggest trouble spots at Beishan. So that's located in between the two areas I have shown you so far. And if you look at this top area where my arrow is pointing, this is arguably the most troublesome spot because just to show you some comparison, on a sunny day, you still can see moisture demarcated by the biodeterioration, but then on a rainy day, you can see water literally gushing out all over, and it's completely wet. The entire wall surface, you can see here, is completely covered in rainwater. The moisture present at the Beishan hilltop is due to rainfall and the general humid condition of the area, and this is rather expected. But a lesser known fact, but equally important reason, lies in the fact that this hilltop, so above all the stones, was once utilized as a farmland until the 1950s. So people were planting vegetables or even rice at the very top, which likely contributed to increasing the underground water reserve in the mountain over the years. So I don't know how long this practice of farming had gone on, but apparently it's built up the water content in the stone. Now, it may seem alarming to us that there's so much water constantly gushing out or pouring over valuable cultural artifacts, like the stone reliefs at Beishan. But for those of you who are familiar with the property of sandstone or sedimentary rocks in general, it is in fact a common phenomenon. The kind of sandstone common in Dazhu is rich in feldspar and quartz and cemented by clay and calcite. Although minerals such as feldspars and clay are weathering prone, the sandstone can still remain durable so long as the mineral structure stays intact and the water can get in and out without hindrances. The growth of microorganisms on stone surface, however, can lead to changes in the moisture circulation patterns and temperature response. This means that the biological growth could form something like a sheet of film on the surface, which might slow or block the evaporation of water of the stone. Another salient feature to keep in mind is that sandstones have large pores within, which makes them more sensitive to salt crystallization than stones with lower porosity. If there is salt present in the water, this would make the stone already affected with biodeterioration even more vulnerable to salt crystallization, thus leading to scaling and flicking on the surfaces. One additional negative effect of biodeterioration is that it could also accelerate the accumulation of atmospheric pollutants, which might result in the formation of black crust, which I will talk a bit later. With today's advances in science and technology, we now know about the properties of stones, as well as the reasons and processes of the deterioration more than ever before. But the point I would like to make is that the artisans in Dazhu must have had some knowledge of all this too. They would not have been able to explain the weathering factors and processes in the same scientific terms we have today. But they did know enough about the property of sandstones to come up with designs that could minimize their decay and implement measures to prolong their lifespan. After all, the practice of carving monumental sculptures on cliff faces have been around in this part of China since the 9th century and is still going strong today. So we're talking about a tradition of over 1,000 years. The tradition's longevity underscores an enduring fascination with creating cultural monuments in nature, as much as a continued pursuit of knowledge and technology needed to materialize this fascination. I will now turn to one of the most salient, notable interventions taken to preserve the stone carvings at Beishan, namely the wooden frame shelter erected around the cliff faces. The structure that currently stands in front of the cliff faces have been renovated in the past few years, hence they look very new. The Daju Academy of Rock Carvings, the official management unit in charge of all the heritage sites in the district, first constructed a protective shelter at Beishan in 1952 as part of a larger conservation project that included the creation of drainage system around the site, the stabilization of the pathway in front of the niches, and the confiscation of the farmland at the hilltop, as I mentioned earlier. Additional ditches were added a few years later so that the drainage system was extended to over 230 meters long, basically spanning through the entire site. There was another round of improvement made at Beishan in the 1990s, during which time the shelter and the drainage system throughout the site were upgraded. The idea of erecting a shelter around a monument might seem rudimentary, but it is no doubt the most straightforward way of keeping it from direct exposure to rain, while promoting adequate air circulation throughout the site. Another benefit for the shelter is that it also provides shade for the stones so that they're not exposed directly to sunlight. This in turn helps reduce fluctuation in temperature of the stone surface, which occurs in the transition from day and night and vice versa daily. As many of you know, dramatic fluctuation in temperature can cause serious cracking and splitting, which would in turn undermine the very stability of the stone. With all the benefits, it is not a surprise that protective shelters were common at heritage sites around the world. In case you're wondering what could possibly go wrong with having a shelter, let me just share with you two examples of bad design. And so both of them are in Sicily, where, as you can see, very good intention of trying to protect the stone. But then if you use glass, putting them so close to the surface, you actually generate a lot more moisture and accumulate and trap the heat. And so it's somewhat similar situation here. So again, using too much glass, so it's creating a greenhouse around the beautiful mosaics on the ground, and so it's not actually good for their well-being. Now returning to Beishan, the local builders seemed aware of the many benefits of having a shelter around carvings on cliff faces. There were once wooden frame structures erected in front of pictorial niches throughout the entire site long before the 20th century, as indicated by all the struck holes on the outer edges of niches. So we can see here, here, and here. Because these structures were built of wood, they would have perished long ago unless they're regularly maintained. So the decay you see here, which is this is the sculpture I showed you earlier on in my talk, might have been deteriorated to this point after the disappearance of the wooden frame structure on the outside. So I would argue that the impermanence of these wooden shelters must have been a reason why cave builders in Daju decided to experiment with a rather different way of providing protection for their stone carvings. To further explore this point, let me turn to a nearby site called Guangdashan, where we find a new way of carving monumental cliff face sculptures. As you can see, the rectangular niche format typical of Beishan was now replaced with a more dramatic stage-like setup. One notable feature of the new format is the carving of a massive awning out of the stone to protrude from the top. Another is the acute angle at which the statues are carved, with the mass of the stone concentrating near the top rather than the bottom, so that the figures appear leaning over the viewer when one stands underneath them. Both features work seamlessly together to compensate for the lack of a front wall, which can help shield the carvings from rainwater. And as it turned out, this new format will become the dominant form of cave design in Daju from the 12th and 13th century onward, as it is on full display at the more famous site, Baotingshan. So as you can see quite clearly that all these carvings are made at an angle, and the awning up front really helps protect it from the rain. So both photographs are taken when it was raining at the site. So you can see that they remain pretty dry. So I would like to conclude with two more photographs taken at the smaller site, Guangdaishan, about 30 years apart. One in the 1980s, the other in 2004. Upon a closer look, you will notice that the figure on your left had deteriorated to a point of illegibility. So this is quite a stunning development, considering that the entire ensemble had remained in fairly good shape over the centuries, as evidenced by the photograph from the 1980s. Although all three figures were evidently repainted time and again, the massive awning had clearly done its job to protect the stone core until quite recently. I have not done extensive research into what happened at the site, but acid rain might well have been the culprit behind the dramatic decay. What we have at Guangdaishan fits the classic descriptions of acid rain's direct effects on stones. The figure on the left is in an exposed position where it is regularly washed by rainwater due to a noticeable dent in the awning directly above. So if I go back to the slide, oops. You notice that this part is broken, so that's why it allows the rain to get more directly onto the surface. So as a result, the acidic content in the rain likely contributed to the mineral dissolution and surface recession in the stone. The central and the right figures, on the other hand, are in a more sheltered position so that they're less prone to the drastic decay, but they're not out of the woods because the reaction products probably have accumulated on the stone surface, resulting in the formation of what appears to be black crust. So for those of you who know a bit about black crust, you know that it expands both inward and outward. So when it expands inward, basically it leads to a pseudomorphic replacement of the stone surface. So that would literally destroy the top. So the situation, in short, points to a underlying so either way, the acid rain problem in Daju is clearly serious, and there is no easy solution in sight because the source of pollution is far away from the site and hence beyond the control of the local management unit or even the district government. The situation, in short, points to an underlying conflict between heritage conservation and development so pervasive in China today, as well as in many different parts of the world. While the eco-art history that I have presented to you today does not offer any immediate remedy to all these problems, I believe that it represents a viable way for art historians to join in the larger efforts to achieve sustainability through research, education, and public outreach. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Chelsea Frazier, a PhD candidate in the Department of African American Studies and a fellow in the Science and Human Culture program at Northwestern University. Her talk today is entitled Theorizing Red and Wounds in Wangechi Mutu's Eco-Art. Let's welcome Chelsea Frazier to the podium.
Thank you so much for that introduction. So I first want to extend my sincere thanks to Rebecca and Christopher and Ashton and Deb and the entire Clark staff for making mine and all of our participation in this exciting program in this gorgeous space possible. I'm very happy to be in the Berkshires for the first time, standing in the not-so-long shadow of enslaved and free Black men and women that gave shape to this region, including the visionary Elizabeth Freeman, an enslaved Black woman who wielded her deep wounds like an armor and who successfully sued her owners for her freedom in August of 1781. securing a different mode of being for herself, and effectively ending legalized slavery in the state of Massachusetts. My talk today is dedicated to her life, visions, struggles, and with that, I'm going to jump in. With Wangechi Mutu's 2004 piece, 100 Lavish Months of Bushwhack, we enter a world of blackish, cloud-like gloom. The cloud grows into a lighter gray, giving way to a spotlighted protagonist, commanding our gaze with her size and elaborate bodily adornments. Curled animal-printed horns frame our protagonist's head, while a grass skirt seems to gesticulate around her waist. The skirt bears an uncanny resemblance to what might be vegetation that emerges from the bottom of the plain, and it remains unclear if the skirt has a liveliness of its own, or if her dance-like gesture with bent elbows and a raised heel is responsible for the skirt's movement. While a small motorcycle functions as a decorative ankle bracelet on the raised foot, 3 other small motorcycles seem to take the place of where the lowered foot might be. That is, if it wasn't a mass of splattered red blood. Similar splatters emanating from yet another small motorcycle crown the figure's head, and the vibrancy of the red and sights of what appear to be wounds indicate both dazzle and danger for the viewer. But danger from who and what? Where we might find hands, the figure wears, or is composed of, hippopotamus mouths, and considerations of a voracious yet vegetarian appetite come to mind, as hippos are very hungry if misunderstood herbivores. And after absorbing all these competing yet intricately stitched together symbols, our eyes are finally free to settle on a smaller and much darker figure, enmeshed in the grayed gloom of the background, ornamented in florals and supporting the weight of the striking protagonist. The obvious, if simple question is, what exactly are we looking at? After recently winning the esteemed 2017 Anderson Ranch National Artist Award, Brooklyn-based, Nairobi-born Wangechi Mutu took the opportunity to insist that, quote, "Art is my way of speaking about things that are unspeakable. It is my truest voice and my strongest form of resistance. It is such a privilege to be recognized in these times for doing what I most love doing. It gives my work more urgency. I know we can do better for one another and for our earth, and I am deeply committed to using creative means to bring attention to violence and inequality against women and to the parallel destruction of our earth," end quote. Her remarks succinctly capture her most urgent political and creative concerns, and Mutu is arguably one of the most prominent living artist intellectuals to repeatedly and consistently, in her interviews, statements, and creative work, center Black femme subjects and bodies in her conceptualizations of our troubled earth ethics. That said, today I seek to situate Mutu's creative and intellectual contributions within and adjacent to a long line of Black studies scholars and ecofeminist thinkers who've carefully conceptualized the relationship between gendered violence and environmental degradation. In convening this conversation, our symposium organizers ask, what is the place of art and its histories in a time of ecological crisis? Art and its histories have long held the potential for transforming our ways of knowing and thinking, destabilizing fixity, and disrupting hegemonic intellectual traditions. As eco-criticism and eco-theories epistemologies continue to contend with their uneven understandings of the interconnectivity of race, gender, and ecological crisis, the question that guides me today is, what is the vocation of Black feminist art and its epistemologies in a time of ecological crisis? Moreover, I ask, what kinds of problems or questions rise like hot steam from eco-theories epistemologies when we place occluded Black femme bodies at the center? As an artist working seamlessly across media, Mutu has theorized the links between Black femininity and earth ethics, through essays, drawing, painting, portraiture, collage, film, performance art, and sculpture. In her collage work specifically, I argue that Mutu makes visible the correlative yet unspeakable relationship between Black femme bodies and other earthly vulnerable material. Though I will focus on just one of her pieces today, I aim to produce a reading of her work that can travel from painting to painting, revealing the ways that Mutu, by employing a strategic use of the color red, illuminates the interrelated ecological wounds of several kinds of bodies: human bodies, bodies of land, and certain political bodies that are routinely occluded from epistemological understandings of ecology. Reductive stereotypes that organize social relationships touch nearly every aspect of modern society. Eco-theory is no exception, and in 100 lavish months of bushwhack, the title alone, as well as a cursory glance at the beguiling protagonist, harkens stereotypes about Blackness and femininity, stereotypes that obscure our ability to discern the ways that race, gender, and environmental pollution reinforce one another. Mutu has spoken publicly about her disdain for stereotypes, but rather than, quote, attacking stereotypes head on, through her work, she explains her tendency to, quote, mine stereotypes for their weak foundations and produce figures that are distillations of her own issues, beliefs, perceptions, and personal stereotypes, end quote. The striking term bushwhack immediately conjures stereotypes about Africa. A synonym for bushwhack is gorillas, not to be confused with the apes. Gorilla is a sister term to bushwhack, and as Kenyan writer Binyavanga Wainaina satirically notes in his essay, How to Write About Africa, it carries significant racialized and gendered weight in pervasive imaginings of African life. The dark gray that engulfs the centered protagonist might be read as smog, acid rain, or other forms of ill-contained earthly pollution, and immediately signals a bleak and ominous environment. On the one hand, this image could be read as a depiction of a stereotype that paints African femme bodies, human bodies, as always already victims of an unruly and aggressive African body of land, a land that is atemporally barren, scorched, ecologically degraded, and sedimented in the past by uncivilized bush people or hyper-violent and destructive power-mad guerrillas. But etymological understandings of the term bushwhacker invite us to consider this work simultaneously as a recapitulation and critique of multi-layered ideas and familiar tropes. If Africa as a privileged geographical reference point is considered alongside spaces and other spaces and times, bushwhacker can also refer to fighters in the American Civil War. Several monographs have been written exploring the ways in which bushwhacker ideals are intimately tied to constructions of white masculinity in the continental US, yet the protagonist's feminine adornments, a high-heeled shoe, pink lipstick, a thickly embellished skirt, and what appears to be either exposed shapely legs or skin-tight bottoms, suggest that the figure is feminine identified. And the polyvalent yet almost always masculine notions of bushwhacker ask the viewer to question what symbolic and material colonial architectures our protagonist is battling. The colonial architectures to which I'm referring, and this is a term I'm borrowing from Denise Ferrer da Silva, include but are not limited to toxic white masculinity, toxic black masculinity, essentialist stereotypes about uncivilized African femme bodies, and decontextualized narratives about African bodies of land. I wish to switch gears a bit, and returning to the Mutu quote I opened with, I want to discuss why the relationship between Black femme bodily woundedness and the degradation of Earth has been rendered unspeakable in the first place. Understanding this obscured epistemological occlusion helps us to understand the heavy challenges Mutu takes on in her work. In her essay, The Idea of Black Culture, seminal Black feminist theorist Hortense Spillers identifies the function of Black diasporic culture as, quote, an alternative statement, as a counter-statement to American civilization/culture or Western civilization/culture, more generally speaking, and identifies the cultural vocation as the space of contradiction, indictment, and the refusal, end quote. It's no secret that the securing of white masculine subjectivity has been integral to the project of Western civilization for centuries, and eco-theory has not escaped the hegemonic influence of that civilizing project. Relatedly, as capitalism has continued to aid and abet white masculine civilizing projects in the West and beyond, many scholars continue to point to capitalism as a primary culprit in aiding, if not creating, our Anthropocene challenges. More often than not, however, discussions of race become drowned out of even our most critical anti-capitalist conversations. But if we continue to recognize that white masculine capitalism continues to underpin the material and discursive order of the West, Horton Spiller's offerings remind us that Black feminist cultural productions retain the potential to occupy standpoints that critique and destabilize exploitative white masculine capitalist spacemaking. But the unspeakability of violence against Black femme subjects persists and remains under-theorized even within Black diasporic critical cultures, rooted in understandings of Blackness that denote static definitions. Black diaspora theorist Michelle Wright argues in her most recent book, The Physics of Blackness, that this tendency derives from epistemological understandings of Blackness that, quote, implicitly reformulates that Black collective into a narrower, ever more homogeneous membership. This homogeneous membership, end quote, sorry. This homogeneous membership often leaves the experiences, lives, and offerings of non-normative, read, non-cisgendered, non-heterosexual, or non-male Black subjects unacknowledged, undetected, and therefore unspeakable. Wright takes up and problematizes the predominance of what she terms the Middle Passage epistemology, its insistence on Blackness as a qualitative value, a what, and the ways in which, quote, Blackness as a vaguely biological what takes on an eerie resemblance to those anti-Black discourses that first claimed Blacks were indeed a what, a distinct subhuman species marked by nature, as Thomas Jefferson opined, end quote. With Wright's insights in mind, and especially with Jefferson's highly celebrated Notes on Virginia being a primary text that aided the proliferation of hegemonic white colonial earth ethics, it is no surprise that Blackness as a vaguely biological what continues to shape the ways in which ecological epistemologies fail to hear and see how race, gender, and other markers of social positioning exceed micro-understandings of identity and contribute to the proliferation of earthly damage on a macro scale. When outlining the function of what she calls a Black feminist poethics, Denise Ferrer da Silva makes clear what is usually rendered invisible under predominant frameworks for understanding power and the effects of colonization by producing an account of capitalist space-making that names the West's reliance on enslaved Black labor and African bodies of land. In her essay, Toward a Black Feminist Poethics, The Question of Blackness Toward the End of the World, before she can move to outlining ethical refusals of colonial architectures. And I'm flagging ethical purposely here because there are certainly unethical refusals of colonial architectures, which we can talk about more later. And some of them we've already talked about over the week. But Da Silva must first describe the amalgamated relationship between Blackness, capital, and the ways in which Marx's narrative of capital accumulation disavows Blackness. She writes, and I quote her at length, "Beginning with slavery is crucial, precisely because a most profitable effect of the tools of scientific reason, which produce the category of Blackness," again, tools of scientific reason, producing the category of Blackness, is precisely the occlusion of the relationship between the enslaved labor and the owners as a sort of juridic arrangement that does not belong in capitalist relations, which are mediated by contract. For in the same statement that articulates how slavery allows for expropriations of the total value produced by chattel labor, Karl Marx disavows any consideration of how enslaved labor, as producer of surplus value, that is, blood-nourishing capital, participates in the accumulation of capital, end quote. Before unpacking this a little bit, I find it important to note that Blackness can be measured through many metrics. Wright, for example, encourages us to understand Blackness through epiphenomenal time rather than ontological fixity. But beginning with slavery helps Da Silva describe the ways in which Marxism occludes the bio-necropolitical relationship where Black blood, surplus value, nourishes capital, which in turn nourishes environmental degradation. Following Da Silva, I aim to speak that ever-intensifying amalgam of environmentally damaging colonial architectures that require Black blood, Black woundedness. In turn, that blood lubricates the amalgam, satiating white masculine capitalist space-making and functioning as the salve by which earthly harm continues. Da Silva articulates this amalgam as well as its refusal in her piece, but the challenge of providing a multisensory experience of the amalgam, as well as its refusal, is where Mutu's genius takes center stage. Returning to 100 lavish months of bushwhack, in addition to the title registering a battle or violence of some kind, the protagonist's wounds guide the viewer's overwhelmed eye. Using cut and pasted printed paper, infused with Mutu's signature use of watercolor, synthetic polymer paint, and pressure-sensitive stickers on transparentized paper, the materials wrestle for our attention until red, which could either be ink or paint, beckons us, focusing our attention on a wound on the left side of the protagonist's head. The wound has transformed the body's material into a mass of blood splatters. And yet their bodily gestures are not attempting to cover or tend to presumed trauma. The brightness of the red calls to mind images of fresh blood spilled, signaling new pain, new violence, and new trauma suffered. The time and cause of the wounds, however, are entirely up for debate, especially because of the dried blood in the back, but may signal the damaging effects of the colonial architectures I've already gestured to, including, again, constructions of war-soaked white masculinity, toxic black masculinity, and essentializing stereotypes about African femme bodies. Wounds this protagonist has sustained may also result from the fact that in order to facilitate capitalist space-making, black femme bodies, as Nicole Fleetwood points out, must continue to be hypervisible and rendered excessive so as to justify their violent, state-sanctioned containment. The exact causes remain irresolvable, suggesting the simultaneity of multiple causes. But what is for sure is the gravity of the wounds we witness in the piece are undeniable. Yet our protagonist's face does not convey anguish. Instead, the figure wears an expression that might be best described as a placid side eye. Thank you, Michelle. Variations of this expression can be found on several figures in Mutu's catalog. For those unfamiliar with the side eye, it is a colloquial term that originated within Black diasporic culture and describes a collection of facial expressions and gestures that subtly convey or disclose sentiments of dissatisfaction, discomfort, or contempt from within the confines of a highly surveilled and/or highly dangerous physical position. Given the history of Black women's highly surveilled physical positions and exposure to vulnerability within settler colonial landscapes, plantations, prisons, White Houses, and other colonial structures, it makes sense that Black femme subjects have conjured gestures that allow them to express themselves, protect themselves by averting their gazes, and communicate with other knowing subjects, all while maintaining enough relative safety to survive. Lest you think I aim to mark woundedness and challenges to survival as markers of disempowerment, however, I seek to reveal the ways that Mutu's seductive reds and splattered wounds create, to borrow language from Spillers, a space of contradiction, indictment, and the refusal of wounds as inherently disempowering. Divergently, the protagonist's wounds at the head and foot can easily be read as adornments. The blood at the head is proudly displayed like a crown, and the blood at the foot, which might normatively be understood as a hindrance to mobility, invites our considerations of non-ableist modes of being in the world. While wounded or even disabled, it is hard to argue that this protagonist is disempowered or lacks agency. Mutu, refusing the ableist sensibilities that proliferate in environmental discourse, turns the normative logics of woundedness and as disempowerment on its head. The centered figure's gesture does not stop at the relative safety or mere survival. The protagonist's side eye instead opens up into an awkward yet elegant bodily expression that could be dancing, could be fighting, could be some combination of the two. The image refuses a definitive reading, but that refusal illuminates the agential yet precarious space between victim and aggressor when certain bodies fall prey to racialized and gendered ecological wounding processes. To close, I offer some open-ended thoughts we might consider together about the nature of power, its relationship to certain bodies, and how we conceptualize earthly damage. Elsewhere, Mutu has noted that, quote, Violent incidences are often fastened to images of privilege in my drawings. There is this tiny percentage of people who live like emperors because elsewhere blood is being shed, end quote. It is with these insights in mind that I want to turn our attention to the easily unnoticed smaller figure in the right corner of the painting. If the larger figure wasn't confounding enough, the smaller figure brings even more questions into view. The relationship between these two figures is unclear, but the fact that the darker figure seems to be serving the lighter-skinned figure calls to mind centuries of racialized depictions of whiteness and blackness in the art historian's mind. In these images, a white supremacist hierarchy inextricably linked to black and brown exploitation is firmly in place. But in Mutu's piece, we are left to wonder about whether this relationship is voluntary or mandatory. Is the relationship exploitative or mutually beneficial? What constitutes vulnerability and who is vulnerable to what? The smaller figure could be a victim of the larger one, positioned literally underneath the larger figure's white-skinned foot, but the larger figure is the one that has or is currently sustaining serious wounds. The size and space between the two figures invites us to wonder whether or not the smaller figure is just slightly avoiding being stepped on by alerting the larger figure to their marginalized presence. Or, by contrast, we might wonder if the smaller figure is supporting the larger figure from a place of disguised and camouflaged safety, hidden away from the amalgam of earthly damage I discussed earlier. One of the most dazzling features of Mutu's work is that the relationships between various bodies and materials are intentionally left ambiguous and allow the viewer's racial, gender, spatial politics to, however uncomfortably, make up their own mind. To begin, I ask what kinds of problems or questions rise like hot steam from eco-theories epistemologies when we place occluded Black femme bodies at the center. In light of our difficulty to conceive of Black femme bodies at the center of most epistemologies, especially ecological ones, Mutu speaks wounded bodies and makes visible processes of racialization and gendering that conceal colonial engravings on exploited Black bodies and bodies of land malformed into blood-nourishing capital. I want to end by posing another question. If most epistemologies can't speak Black femme subjects despite the centrality of their woundedness to the destruction of Earth, how might we continue to mine Black feminist art, not for resolutions to poorly conceptualized problems, but for better understandings of our hopeful yet damaged presence? Thank you.
Our panel's final speaker is Robert Felfe, professor of 17th and 18th century art at the art history, at the Universität Hamburg, and a member of Naturbilder, Images of Nature Research Group. His talk for today is titled Pre-Modern Geosphere, Nature's Workshop, Treasure House, and Deep Time. Let's welcome Robert Felfe.
Okay, I really enjoy to be here, though thank you for that kind invitation and for the possibility and occasion for me to step back in my research from material I did study for several years and to look for ways in which that might be of any relevance in the horizon of actual problems, contemporary problems we have with ecological, colonial, and other situations, yes, we are discussing these days. So, Pre-modern geosphere, nature's workshop, treasure house, and deep time. As an introduction, I want to show you a short sequence from Song for Coal, an art project by Nick Crow and Ian Rawlinson, presented at the Yorkshire Sculpture Park 2015. The presentation combined a video installation in an 18th century neo-Gothic chapel unfolding a kaleidoscope of fragments coming from the iconographies of coal and its relevance for culture, with the performance of a choral, originally arranged for this occasion and based on different historic source materials. The piece thus connected the natural deposits of the mineral with its career as fossil fuel, its role as a basic resource for the industrial culture of whole regions, with its ongoing and even increasing importance as a source of energy, and the relevance of this constellation for global climate change, real problems, as well as apocalyptic scenarios. So I hope I can start it now. Oh, can I close that and open the PowerPoint? Sorry for that. Okay, thank you. Thank you. At first sight, the work may appear conventional. Individual motifs from cold culture history are sampled and set to music. Even integrating into a religious context, the sacred architecture and choral song may strike some viewers as dubious sublimation of a difficult history. And yet, this transcendence does make sense. It implies several partly buried aspects of early modern relationships between the fine arts and nature without highlighting them explicitly. They may even be unintentional. It is well known that on the one hand, early modern art and art theory assumed nature would have specific potentials for making images. One of these examples, most frequently quoted, can be found in Leon Battista Alberti's Libro della Pittura from 1437 and contains a description of the images of centaurs and heads of kings painted in stone by nature herself. But on the other hand, such conceptions were also of importance in natural history. This is especially true for discussions of such curious phenomena as dendrites, those figured stones which are today considered to be the fossil remains of living beings. These debates remained controversial up until the 18th century. For a long time, these natural things provoked contradictory interpretations and genetic explanations. Concepts such as nature as an artist or the ludi naturae, the playful nature, provided the backdrop for a broad spectrum of interpretations. Their particular scientifically creative potential, however, was not limited to this fairly general topos or allegorical concept. Yet within the scope of these phenomena, concrete image-making procedures were used and tested as models for explanation of these natural images. In his Museum Metallicum, the Bologna-based collector and scholar Ulisse Aldrovandi, Rebecca mentioned him in the introduction speech yesterday in the morning, presented as one among various other stony images from nature the admirable figure of a fish which the playful nature had painted precisely in stone. The fact that the image is supposed to have been printed is by no means trivial. Instead, the technological specificity substantiates hypothetical reflections regarding its origin. Another fossilized fish is described by Aldrovandi as though it had been drawn with extreme precision using a pencil, pensillo delineate. When talking about marble, the same author distinguished between dashed-off animal creatures and those plants which he describes as extremely finely painted, elegantissima picte, and also mentions vegetable figures composed of such subtly drawn lines that the eye can hardly distinguish them. Particularly bold speculations about the concrete genesis of such images in stone can be found in Michele Mercati's Metallotheca Vaticana. The original text and the majority of the elaborate copperplate engravings date from 1580. Yet it is only in 1717 that the work was printed with occasional critical annotations, and it then became one of the standard reference works of mineral literature and collecting. Several passages of this publication make it clear that the collector of Naturalia considered nature's image-making potentials as by far surpassing the quality of techniques and medias humans employed in the making of art. Using a particularly delicate dendrite as an example, the author shows that contrary to any doubts about nature's perfect workmanship, it was evident that such a rich diversity of shape could not be artificial, but had to be produced by nature itself. Whereas, according to the author, artificial painting produced only copies of things which rested like shadows on the surface, nature had also added soliditas, means density, solidity, and thickness, to its painting on stone, while also establishing particular relationships between individual parts. This aspect is further elaborated in the description of fossils, as for instance in these fishes. The lustrous golden metallic animal bodies in black stone are described as a relief of superimposed layers of painted tablets. In this case, the author describes a mixed media artifact which does not really exist in art practice, simply in order to give the reader a hypothetical idea of the visible qualities of such a thing. And inevitably, such a description evokes a fictional yet concrete artisanal procedure as model of the process of generation. Scholars and collectors in this field of research observed the correspondence of shape and color in the material of the figured stones, which humans hardly ever achieved in the arts. To put it differently, nature was seen to employ an art technology which incorporated painting and sculpture in one, combining the distribution of color and the gestation of bodily shapes at the core of substances. In comparison with painting and sculpture, nature, according to this argument, surpasses both because of its ability of endogenous construction of form. This was something that fine art was definitely unable to achieve. Especially in this variation on the paragone, the competition between art and artists, as we know it from the early modern art history, nature had a tendency to have the advantage over the human artifacts. And at the same time, via the description of phenomena, visual arts techniques were the terrain for a collective thought experiment that was shared by naturalists involved in pre-modern earth sciences. The second chapter now. A particularly interesting figure in the context of early modern connections between art and earth sciences is Bernard Palissy, painter on glass, potter, and garden architect. As an artist, he was especially appreciated for his so-called rustique figurines. These polychrome ceramic sculptures are casts from nature. Their negative shapes were cast directly from the bodies of the respective animals or parts of plants. Subsequently, a ceramic material was poured into these molds in order to produce artificial bodies as exact substitutes of the preceding living objects. In a final stage, colored glazes were applied and then they were burned one last time. Animal casts especially required the killing of the formerly living being before taking the mold. In the next step, the dead bodies had to be incinerated within the mold in order to get as pure and negative shape as possible. Detailed descriptions of similar techniques quite explicitly relate the procedure as a coherent process of killing, burial, complete decomposition, and final recreation. So the technology of making casts from nature could be understood as the artificial realization of a metabolic cycle, culminating in a body which was a quasi-living being again and imperishable at the same time. The striking effect of suggestive illusionism is primarily the result here of the detailed modeling of the lifelike body. In addition, the body's postures often appear as though they had been suddenly arrested in mid-motion and as though these locomotions could proceed at any moment. In many cases, these individual sculptures were mounted on large platters, plates, or jugs. In combination with these vessels, the casts from nature evoked micro-landscapes with a suggestion of water, the bank of a brook or pond, for instance. These splendid vessels, in the shape of artificial habitats, were in great demand as collector's items. This oval bowl, for instance, which is on the collection of the Kunsthistorische Museum in Vienna today, used to be part of one of the curiosity cabinets owned by the Habsburgers. With Bernard Palissy, we can trace a sustained interest in the geosphere on several levels. On the one hand, it constitutes the conceptual framework for his art as potter, from the materials he worked with to the iconography of his sculpted works. On the other hand, we have a considerable body of Palissy's writings in which he noted down and published his own observations of natural phenomena with a far-reaching hypothesis about the mineral build-up, hydraulic balance, and the fertility of the earth. There are two ways in which Palissy considered his work as potter to be analogous to the creation of natural forms, especially as regards scale formation. Firstly, the composition of different clays could be regarded as imitating the material compound out of which all forms in nature were formed. Around 1548, he had developed his so-called jaspis ceramics. These ceramics were characterized by interior drawing and the working principle of compound clays imitating the veins and marbling effects of natural stone, as well as the plethora of potential shapes which manifested themselves within this. The forced mimesis of individual creatures, as practiced in casting from life, followed upon this artificial imitation of the qualities of natural materials. In the potter's opinion, the remarkable verisimilitude of his small sculptures was not solely an effect of the suggestive appearance of figure and surface. Rather, this aesthetic effect was the result of a more far-reaching mimesis of the stone's interior structures, enabling clay as matter to take on the shape of animals and plants, to take on the shapes of animals and plants. In the drawing and color of the glazed surfaces, this mimetic process is brought to fruition. Soil and stone as points of departure for this art are here by no means considered simply as raw material. Instead, they are an active principle in themselves and a complex source of causes. The potter adapts and manipulates this active principle, and in his Rustique Figuline, the lowly natural realm of the mineralia evolves into the higher realms of vegetabilia and animalia, with ostensibly living plants and animals. These ceramic works could also be integrated within a larger context, as for example in the artificial grottos designed by Palissy. We know for sure of two such installation projects. The first one he planned for the Duc de Montmorency in Écouen, and he worked on the second around 1570 for Maria de Medici in the Royal Gardens in the Tuileries in Paris. It remained unfinished, the Paris grotto remained unfinished when Palissy died in the Bastille in 1580, probably as a consequence of the confessional conflicts. In the grotto ensembles, Rustique Figuline populate an artificial wilderness, which was celebrated as a milieu of the earth's primordial fertility. The rooms were lavishly furnished with water, basins, and fountains. And the water in these ostensibly subterranean rooms evoked the condition of mineralogical process as well as an abundant organic growth. In addition, the water here was used to keep food and drinks chilled and was also served as a beverage. In fact, artificial grottos were not least the sites for festive banquets. We know that Maria de Medici enacted the mythical figure of Cybele or Ceres as a nurturing mother of France in the context of such banquets and in the setting of artificial grottos. The individual rustique figurine, a sculpted work of art, embodied a transformation from the state of mineral to the seemingly alive animal. Within the context of artificial grottos and banquets, they also took on the role of agents for a far larger nature, whose main distinction was the incessant production of nourishment. If courtly elites celebrated their own consumption of food in such an environment, this gesture entailed the promise of surfeit and wealth as stable foundation of all society as well as an effect of its own rule. In his own writings, especially the Discours Admirable of 1580, Palissy describes his art as part of a comprehensive ecology with a national emphasis. The book begins with a description of the hydraulic balance of the earth, remarks on the building of wells, as well as the irrigation systems for gardens and fields. This forms the basis for all civilization as well as the arts. Of all arts, those which employ clay and other earths are especially tied into this context, whereas the rustique figurine are that very art form which reflects this in a particular fashion. I have to take some water by myself now. At about the same time, the decades around 1600, natural history of the Earth gained a new temporal momentum in European thinking. Observations and speculation about fossils were not simply limited to the process of their formation as image-like appearances. Since the early 17th century, the problem was regarded primarily in the context of the respective geological environments and the various forms of the surface of the Earth, from flat plains to high mountain regions, raised the question of changes and their causes. This soon involved also a historical dimension of temporality beside the time implied by form generation. Initially, mythical concepts informed and framed this historical time. Corner points were mainly the biblical history of creation, the deluge, and the apocalypse. Very soon, however, this discourse surrounding the Earth's natural history gained a momentum which extended and ultimately destroyed this framework. Besides natural historical methods of research, particular core metaphors played an important role in this process. They provided compatible connections to the fine arts and fundamentally influenced the cultural design of geological knowledge far beyond the circle of experts and researchers. In this case, they were mainly architectural metaphors. The metaphorical speech about buildings and their parts made it possible to think of the Earth as a fundamentally tectonic order. It could be seen as a system of horizontal floors and vertically supporting parts, as well as different rooms, caves, for instance, which many authors assumed veined the entire Earth body in a system of basements and catacombs. One of this metaphor's main achievements was the transformation of the geosphere with all its irregular shapes, the frequently overwhelming relations of scale and undiscovered regions into an artificial and rigorously ordered context. It was preeminently architecture as an art form which embodied the regularity of measurements and proportion, functionality, symbolic qualities, and physical technological performance. Based on this combination of aspects, architectural metaphors continued to influence important areas of an Imagologie, we would say in German. I don't have any idea if you have a notion in English language for that. Imagologie means the whole complex of visual fantasies, but also realized artworks as a kind of Imagologie. Sorry for that. Based on this combination of aspects, architectural metaphors continue to influence important areas of an imagologie of the Earth up until early modernity. And at the same time, the transferal of the building's aesthetic qualities onto natural phenomena was used to develop scientific models in order to explain their genesis. Up until the late 19th century, this, in regard to high mountain ranges, for example, constituted an important strategy for the cultural and scientific appropriation of regions largely uncontrolled by civilization at that time. In this context, it was also characteristic for the broad dissemination and argumentative value of architectural metaphors that they faced in two opposite historical directions. On the one hand, we encounter metaphorical speech declaring the mountains regions of the earth, due to their irregular and weathered shapes, to be enormous ruins. One of the most prominent voices in this connection was Thomas Burnet. In his cosmological speculation, Telluris Theoria Sacra of 1681, he proclaimed the current condition of the earth as a pitiful state of ruin. Here you see the frontispiece. Burnet views this maximum of disorder and decay cosmologically as tied into a cyclical process. The biblical chaos had been succeeded by an impeccable state of initial creation on the right side, under the feet of Jesus Christ, yet this had been destroyed by the deluge, and it would only be delivered out of this current state of decay in the apocalypse's world fire, full stop. According to Burnet, this would be superseded by a new phase of perfection until the natural existence of the earth would culminate in its metamorphosis into a star on the left side above. The previous order of creation could then only be intuited based on fragments and detritus. The most poignant manifestation of this state of ruin were mountains, because they so obviously contradicted any idea of order. Burnet's metaphor of the ruin transforms the earth into a monument of a lost divine order, and this state offers no escape, either for nature or human history. Naturally, there were opposing views to the radically negative manifestation of the earth, to this radically negative manifestation of the earth. And these were also inclined to use architectural metaphors. It is noticeable that in the face of mountains, rocks, and chasms, the appearance of irregularity, disproportion, and disarray could apparently not be denied as such. The earth phenomena could not readily be understood as an orderly context to be or be integrated into a well-organized entirety. Even for this challenge, architecture itself supplied an aesthetic trick, which geological sciences adapted. Thus, in the middle of the 17th century, the Neapolitan Jesuit Jacopo Bartoli, for instance, came up with a virtuoso interpretation for the evident disarray and lack of proportion on the Earth's surface. Phenomena such as the mountains should be seen as a new art of architectonic composition, whose very appeal resided in the fact that under the ostensible lack of order and norm, art concealed itself. And this very concealment was emphasized as evidence of a particularly skillful craftsmanship of the divine architect, of course. This reinterpretation was implicitly based on actually existing varieties of early modern architecture. Bartoli himself probably had those artificial grottos in mind, which had been designed for Mannerist and Baroque gardens and which had been built by Palissy, for instance, as we've seen. Around 1700, authors like John Woodward in London or Johann Jakob Scheuchzer in Zurich pursued Bartoli's argument for ostensible array as the highest art form and thereby directly contradicted Burnet. Beside grottos and artificial ruins in Baroque parks, may have been important, besides grottos, the artificial ruins in Baroque parks may have been important references for both of them. They rejected Burnet's opinion with a fair amount of scorn. He did not appear to be able, so they claimed, to recognize in his mind's eye, and contrary to outward appearances, that creators particularly masterly art in the sublime order of nature. Yet the present earth in this masked art of architecture was no ruin at all, but a complete new construction which had followed upon the deluge. The debates about the earth as an actual ruin or as an artificial ruin and as such a completely new construction revolved primarily around various historical perspectives. Burnet's cycle was aimed chiefly as a hermeneutics of nature. It remains within a strictly defined and closed framework of a Christian plan of salvation. Woodward and Scheuchter's version of a present earth as a new building, on the other hand, opened up the horizon for an open-ended, interconnected history of earth and civilization. Designed after the deluge for human purposes, this divine architecture of the earth was by far more promising for progressive scientific research, territorial development, and industrial exploitation. Irrespective of these differences in the use of architectural metaphors of the earth, an elective affinity was established in the 17th century epistemologically informing universal history as well as the geological sciences. Those who were interested in minerals, fossils, and the geologic phenomena often considered their work as being analogous of that of antiquarians and later archaeologists. One of the most noted statements along these lines is by Robert Hooke. We heard about him as well, the renowned microscopist and curator of the Royal Society collection in London. He wrote around 1675 about fossils, quote, "These are the greatest and most lasting monuments of antiquity, which in all probability will far antedate all the most ancient monuments of the world, even the very pyramids, obelisks, mummies, hieroglyphics, and coins, and will afford more information in natural history than those others put together will in civil." Scheuchter, whom I mentioned before, used this analogy not just verbally, but in the context of arranging a collection of pictorial material for book projects about minerals and petrofacts. One example for this are some drawings of idyllic ruin landscapes on top of which the crude fragments of individual stones are disposited in a trompe-l'oeil manner, as though there existed a real, maybe even natural connection between the ruined buildings of antiquity and the accretion of stones. In other instances, as in this collage of different prints, for example, the gesture of showing something and the visual argument points into another direction. Could be described as regard these stones, in this case fragments of ammonites, as witnesses from nature's past, in the same way in which you look at antique Rome's ruins and fragments as precious witnesses of the past time and history. Yet Hooke, Scheuchter, and other collectors and researchers from the 17th, 18th century onwards assumed quite self-confidently that their evidence of natural history in the shape of material remnants could transmit information about the past not only more directly but also more reliably than any linguistic documents. They were also convinced that these constituted a body of tradition with a further reach into the past than any remains of past cultures. And by self-defining as archaeology the natural history of the earth, discovered a deep time which was no longer tied to the time of myth and human history. Yet today, this long time process must be considered on an almost opposite premise to that under which it appeared to the naturalists in the 17th and 18th century. Back then, an objective historization of natural history entailed a certain destabilization of the cultural self-image, and it was one of the narcissistic humiliations within our Western history of becoming subjects. But in the face of the nature that is always gravely affected by human societies, what is at stake today is to think of both as a shared history, humanity in nature and nature in humanity. Under this premise, we can look back to the early modern times and find somehow encapsulated within the concepts of an objective history of nature, independent of man, surprisingly alternative traces. Of course, the visual art of the early modern times don't give answers to the ecological crisis of the present, but for a long time, they were a very prolific site where artists and other thinkers deliberated about natural processes and about how the history of nature and culture was intertwined. Thank you.
So we have time for our speakers to take some questions.
Hello. Thank you all for 3 just absolutely dazzling papers. Not in the name of just getting things started, but what occurred to me is a continuum that runs through everything that was spoken in very, very different ways is the relationship between damage and creativity. Are you kidding?
Yes, no, I'm not kidding at all.
All right. Like,
We're on the same page.
that's good. That was what I was thinking. This isn't, I don't really don't, it's not a fully formed question, but it's articulated in very different ways, not just natural destruction, not in terms of sort of, as it were, physical violence and destruction, or natural decay. But I would just throw it open to anyone to sort of speak about if there's something to that. Then again, how, not necessarily damage usually posed as a counter to creativity. Creativity is being the making of something or the rearranging of pre-extant things, and damage is being the sort of annihilation of that. But, oh, here.
Can I add on to that? Yeah, because, I mean, just one of the ways in which the question of damage came up for me in thinking about the 3 papers together is just the conversations we'd had yesterday about complicity and thinking about early modern science and the relationship of, someone like Aldrovandi or even Palissy to like colonial projects and knowledge production that came out of them, right? And so, but then also the, Palissy's experiments with porcelain that involved breaking the thinking about his sort of thinking about China as a place of kind of the production of amazing kind of miraculous objects that were at the border of art and nature, that he was breaking pieces of porcelain to try to figure out how they were made, right? And the destruction that was involved in casting those figurines. So I think the question, and this is just sort of restating Christopher's question, but with that background too, is just when is damage just damage, right? When is when is damage just damage, and when is it enabling not only for the perpetrator of the damage, but for the objects of the damage, right? And that also maybe connects Sonya's paper to Jamie's, also in terms of thinking about these destructive effects of ecological kind of processes. Is that ever something that's not just damage, but kind of productive of something new? And then, of course, Chelsea, your paper is all about that, right? Wounding and kind of how to take woundedness as something enabling and not only disabling, right?
I guess I will start. I've been actually thinking a lot about the question of agency to explain the kind of material I'm working on, stone deterioration. So it's actually not as simple as I would like to put it, because how do we assign agency if you look at it scientifically? So Is it the water that's doing damages to the stone? Because it's actually an important part of it. Without water, the stone can actually fall apart because it can become brittle. So it's both the cause and also the effect of the destruction. And in conservation science or in science in general, one can sort of equate agency with what is being called catalyst. But if we think about acid rain, for example, oftentimes scientists have sort of pinpoints the culprit, and that's really sulfuric dioxide in the air, and it's basically a product of burning of fossil fuels. And so, in some way you can put it down, but is it the real cause behind the destruction that we see on the stone? Probably yes. You can sort of say that's the culprit, but the real cause is actually anthropogenic, that because we are burning those fossil fuels. And so it's very hard to pin it down, and I think in my project I've come to realize that a lot of the discussion we have from a more humanistic perspective may come into conflict when we start to think about it from a rather different perspective, like in the sciences.
In terms of damage, I think that, kind of following Mutu's preoccupations with transformation, I'm interested in the ways that destruction offer opportunities for transformation. And I don't mean that to say, that I'm interested in romanticizing destruction or violence in any way. But I think, part of my, as I've sort of argued elsewhere, part of my gripes with like a reconciliatory politics is this emphasis on kind of like, fixing, resolving, and a notion of being healed as kind of like a liberatory fixed point that we might gesture to, right? But I don't believe in that. I'm not interested in that, and I think that most of the most critical and creative ways of being are usually wrought from, destructive, transformative instances. A lot of the time that ends up being trauma for a lot of subjects whose kind of like ontological social positioning is itself a trauma and then invites more trauma, right? And so that's how I think that I've been thinking about damage, destruction, and kind of like other related phenomena.
So I think the aspect of damage is really important insofar as kind of trigger to give new impulses for human investment or for doing work for finding new orientation on the one hand, or to come into really procedures of interaction of metabolic or other kinds of cycles with nature and ecological environments on the one hand. But that's just maybe productive side of that, and this productive side has been somehow overestimated, and even in economic theories, as for example the productive destruction in Schumpeter's capitalismus theory, which has been adopted quite eagerly by some politicians in strategic papers for how to destruct other political orders, the societies of other countries, to realize their own purposes there. And so I would be really careful with the kind of general emphasis on destruction as such a productive moment, but in certain concrete artistic concepts and procedures, in certain fields of action, interaction between human societies and their environments, it is an important, kind of yes, an occasion to invest labor and new activities into the whole system, and though it is one key point, I think.
I just think, Robert, in Palissy's context, you've got a moment in which, damage and art's relationship is completely reconceptualized because of iconoclasm, which Palissy may or may not have had knowledge of, but as a kind of participant in these moments, this is not just damage as creative, destruction as creative, but damage as opposed to a sort of annihilation.
Sorry.
I'm just saying, I'm just wondering if, I mean, again, you sort of were very cautious about that, wisely so, about Palissy's confessional determinism.
Yes. It's a funny thing. In the end, I mean, he is a Protestant in all these religious conflicts going on in France at this time. Realizes, or is trying to realize some of the biggest, yes, we could say, image-making projects, whatever. But if you see that in the context of his more and more growing interest in this bigger ecological framework, then it is not kind of worship triggered via images or pictorial practice, as we know that in other religious contexts, specifically in the Catholic Church at this time. But it is a kind of, he understood, I'm sure of that, he understood his art practice more and more as a kind of core piece, acting as an artist within a larger field of economics in the end. And this economic meant primarily the question, how can we make sure that the soil of our French territory is the most comfortably nourishing in comparison also with other European countries, in comparison with Italy, in the contest and political struggle with the Habsburg territories and so on. And that's, I think, one reason why also Habsburgs were so keen to buy his Plato works, for example, because it was one implicit iconography.
And just quickly, I mean, he's like, I think a key figure for kind of noting that nature can be damaged, right, in comparison to other people in his time who were arguing that, you know, nature's kind of miraculously abundantly plentiful and never can be, you know, can't be hurt. He actually argued that nature could be hurt, right?
Yes, thanks. Robert, in your descriptions of Palissy's ceramics, they were about killing nature in order to preserve art, right? Preserve or kill in order to preserve. And I'm not going to turn to you, Sonya, to ask you about the recent century or more of climate change, but the earlier centuries in which these monuments lived and slowly died. Is there not something, a strand in Chinese philosophy, as there is in so much Western philosophy about letting things go through a natural change and slowly die? I just imagine that there is. And how would you reconcile that with trying to hurriedly preserve them, say, in the 18th century or the early 19th century?
Oh, thank you for the question. If you look into earlier Chinese philosophy, there's indeed a lot of discussion about seeing destruction as part of the life cycle of things. If you don't destroy things, how can you get new things? So I guess we get the same mentality in today's consumer culture. Anyway, but I think what's interesting here is that you can think about to what extent the locals actually adopted this kind of thinking. Maybe they didn't think about this at all. And from my study of a lot of sites in this part of China, for example, repainting or restoration was a very common phenomenon throughout. So it was perfectly fine to restore the part that fell apart, and it's perfectly fine to put some new paint on when the old one disappeared, because everybody knew that these things will not last forever, but at least last long enough that at least during the stakeholder's lifetime that you can see them. But what gets tricky is that if you look at it from a very long view, say, in centuries as opposed to decades, you see many different periods of abandonment and revival, and it's not continuous. And so so as a historian looking back from the 21st century, then we see those disjuncture, points of disjuncture. And so rather than thinking or sort of fit everything in one continuous narrative without any interruption, I'm trying to capture that and talk a lot about how people responded. And sometimes it might be best just to start anew, go to a different mountain and craft some new things. Sometimes that because the site has such a lure in that community, people continue to go back, but not necessarily continue what the people 300 years ago started. They start something else. So, so destruction, yes, it's definitely part of the story, but not in terms of the things that you learn, say, in the classic of Waste and Potency or in the Book of Changes.
Yes, thank you for this session. And my question is to Norbert and to Sonya, because I'm trying to avoid now discussion the idea of damage, though I think it is important for all the three of you in this session. But I think that maybe another point that can be raised, and it's part of what I think also Michael was referring to, is the idea or the dream of or the utopia of the fossil. The fossil is a specific freezed state that we are all aiming to in order to keep history documented at best. I mean, the utopia, if we could freeze each century in the deep freezer and then just have it there, not being, affected by any other effects of nature, that would be great. We will keep to the idea of how we measure time in seconds and freezing time into a measure stages that we could then organize them and create evolution in the best way. But it is interesting to see that the fossil that Norbert had shown, which is a kind of an utopian thing to create, is not working, because even these fossil works are being affected by time and have to be preserved and so on. So I'm thinking of nature of creating another time tempo which is inflicted by damage, inflicted by subjective time that is sometimes is not, how shall I say it, is not measured objectively, but according to what's happening in the world. And it could be a quick time or a slow time, depends on catastrophes or horror or peaceful time. So I'm just thinking about, can we change the whole idea of time, trying to think in other way of measuring time that will give us another way to look at works of art, and to leave some other to die, to freeze some other, but to create more flexible idea of time. I know it's a big question, but I aspire to big answers as well.
From my side, and looking at my material, I could say that, of course, it is to conceptualize time in a way that we, in Western cultures, didn't do that before. Was one kind of background story in the three examples I was discussing here in this paper, and that's an ongoing story because, of course, then in the since the late 18th century up to the early 19th century, the natural deep time, which was then seen to be not bound on neither on human-made artifacts or textual tradition, ancient nor to mythic or other kind of narratives we have in the background. So that was gone. Nevertheless, scientists, as for example William Backlund in Oxford, tried to rebind it into the biblical mythological history and so on. And there was one kind of type of time model was so-called catastrophe theories, saying that every important change in natural history, and also, of course, since human beings lived on the world, also then for them, was caused by catastrophic ruptures in a continually ongoing time. So, and it was in the 1830s, Charles Lyell, with his principle of geology, he balanced this model again into so-called actualism, declaring that the ongoing, even disruptive and destructive forces and procedures going on in nature, they are not a totally kind of interruption or kind of impact and complete break in every ongoing time flow, but they were different layer steps into a bigger history, and since a long time human beings, human culture, societies and these events lived side by side. And so that's maybe not the answer on the whole question you posed me, but I think it's to think about time is one big issue in this part of thinking about nature I spoke about, of course. And it was to get an open horizon for a kind of a human history which could then be conceptualized as a sacralized history with an outlook on prosperity and what we then called sometimes development, was not at least shaped and figured in this context, or this was one component to figure this perspective of history, but that's also fragments of an answer. We may discuss that maybe later, but I will give it to you both.
It's a very big question. I guess if we just set aside all the man-made interventions in this particular context and think about the rocks in geological time, the formation of sedimentary rocks, it's a constant process. So it's involved the breakdown of some earlier stones, and then it mixed with other things. So it's constantly evolving. But as soon as we start to carve something on the surface, we somehow switch the way we talk about time from geological to human time. And somehow that really changes the dynamics. And if we tend to focus way too much on the human intervention, then we tend to forget about the deeper geological time of which this object, the sculpture, is a part. And so one thing we can do is really try to address this imbalance in our scholarship. So that's why I'm trying to do that through looking at the deterioration to bring the time factor back in. And also in the bigger project, I no longer put myself in the historical, as a historian, that I only look at things when they're first made, but in fact what has happened to it afterwards. So look at the reception and the transformation that has taken place over time.
The question, I thought the question of time and duration actually went through all of your papers, and also the metaphors we use to discuss that time, whether it's a sort of moralizing narrative that we propose or one that's very human-based. And I actually want to turn to you, Chelsea, because I think what struck me since even Vittoria de Palma's presentation yesterday, right, where we started with that passage of Hippocrates, and we realize for how long the discussion of climate and ecology has been one tied to human differentiation. And so the discussion, I was so excited to have race brought concretely into this discussion. We see it not just as far back as Hippocrates, but even now when we talk about deforestation in Haiti, we're thinking about what sources we use, right? People actually in Haiti are like, actually we have plenty of trees, but we rely on certain interlocutors for so long to tell us certain stories about the destruction of nature over time. And so I was wondering if you would elaborate more, actually, on that really pivotal moment in your talk where you're talking about the sort of construction of natural history and the construction of race and racial knowledge.
Sure. Well, I rely a lot on Black feminist geographers, so Catherine McKittrick and Tiffany Lafabo King, her newer work, thinking about Black feminine bodies as space-making kind of tools, right? Space-making tools that render Black feminine bodies like not able to occupy space in the same way that that align completely with settler colonial logics, right? But that allow for, you know, settler colonial logics to continue to proliferate and then to organize how we make sense of all kinds of materials, right? Be they trees, be they time itself, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things that it's really hard to think, it's hard to think of Blackness and then Blackness as it converges with gender as mattering, to follow, you know, kind of like the theme, without thinking about a different kind of world, right? So there's tons of logics, including time, including the way that we normatively make sense of space, the way that we normatively understand and organize matter, that are not discernible if we try to think of the ways that Blackness as an organizing principle, you know, orders our present world. The only way to think about it sort of unyoked from you know, those logics is to just like imagine something else. And so why Mutu is so helpful for me and a lot of the other people that I look at in my larger project is because they are gesturing towards that other world, and it's really difficult to articulate a logic that is like almost purely speculative, right? But that is necessary if we think about how we want to approach these larger questions from an ethics, not necessarily, you know, morality, right? But an ethics that is, I think, responsibly trying to contend with the fact that the Anthropocene challenges we're dealing with right now are rooted in a particular logic of time and space that renders some subjects constantly vulnerable to not only constantly vulnerable to particular violences, but also occluded from, you know, a consideration of their expertise, right, in their own land, for their own bodies. So, yeah. I hope that.
No, thank you very much.
Okay, I had a couple of thoughts and questions, I was thinking about temporality just before Abhinav asked his question, but I was thinking about it in a slightly different way, and it was a way that's more a dialectic through which I think each of these papers deal with subjectivity that is engaging with layered temporalities in ways that I think are quite interesting. In the case of Sonya's paper, I was thinking particularly not so much about the kind of philosophy of decay and decline, but more the idea of constant renewal, which is certainly true in India, where you have temple murals that both are and are not 500 years old, because they have, you know, the idea is they're 500 years old, but they've been ritually repainted in order to keep them fresh and anew. In the case of Chelsea's paper, I think that you're dealing with a kind of something that is rooted in a historic relationship, and a deep one, as you've shown, with the construction of Blackness and the construction of race and the kind of the damage wrought by colonialism, which, as you point out, is a damage that is not actually ever really resolvable. It's something that we all would like to see resolved because it makes us feel better, but actually in reality, it's something that actually marks a real rupture. And I think that's true in the case of fossils as well, as dealing with the kind of both the remarkable nature of this deep history that's preserved, and yet its inherent fragility in the way in which it can break, and how that is then engaged with and preserved through the kinds of art projects that you're describing and the installations as well. So I don't know whether or not you wanted to sort of talk about those kind of the ways in which each of you are dealing with a kind of moment where there's an engagement with multiple layers of pasts in ways that are both protective of, but also quite consciously aware of their inherent vulnerability and susceptibility to change.
Thank you so much for those offerings and for that question. I have been thinking about the first question about damage and then this sort of like emerging question about temporality. And I think, so in terms of like protecting particular kinds of cultural practices that emerge from damage, right? Like, I think that there is a temporal lag between the initial invitation that, the initial invitation for transformation that comes from particular kinds of traumas and the ways in which cultural practices sediment over time in order to make sense of and author kind of like different modes of being, right? Like it doesn't happen immediately. To your question, Christopher, about what's damage that's just damage, right? Because in order to get to a point where we can theorize the agential space of disability or of woundedness, right? Millions had to be obliterated. And so that's where and not just, and I don't mean millions in terms of like human bodies, I mean like, millions of cultures, millions of human bodies, millions of, plants and animals and other earthly microorganisms, right? That had to be completely and utterly displaced, annihilated, rendered into blood splatters in order for us to sort of discern like, okay, this is an ontological position that in order for survival and the proliferation of life to continue in this, or non-life to continue from this position, there has to be an attention to particular cultural practices that have aided and abetted survival in the face of, ridiculous threats of destruction, right? So I think in terms of like the connection between temporality and kind of my own anxious hesitation just approaching all of the aspects of this project to preserve and acknowledge initial traumas, right? Initial wounds wrought, but to try to sort of like rework them and rethink them in ways that move us beyond somewhere else. Like that's sort of how I'm kind of entering that conversation about, or that thinking about time and about damage. Yeah, so thank you.
Well, thanks for that comment about renewal. In my case, it has more to do with the concept of authenticity, because up to the 20th century or even mid-20th century, the people who were active at the site operated with a very different notion of authenticity. Actually, they really didn't care about keeping the original appearance of things. And it's perfectly fine to repaint and restore. But then after the site became a protected cultural property, and after 1999, it became a World Heritage Site, a very different concept of authenticity has been applied, and it has affected every aspect of conservation. And so for me, to deal with this question is more to do with management than with the kind of processes I described here. But it's a very different, complex, and long process. I'd be happy to talk more about it later.
Thanks. I had a question for Chelsea. First, thanks for 3 wonderful talks. Picking up on your talk in particular, Chelsea, I was curious about the way in which you articulated a kind of ingrained ambiguity in Mutu's work. And I was wondering if you could say a little more about that, particularly because one of the ambiguous aspects of the piece that struck me is the degree to which there is or isn't a kind of masking of both figures. The larger figure could be seen as masked or could not be seen as masked. The smaller figure could be seen as wearing nothing or in fact wearing something that covers its entire body. And to put this in dialogue with your position as scholar, as interpreter of the work, as the person who's doing a kind of unmasking through a kind of iconology or iconography of articulating what aspects of the work mean relative to the kind of theoretical frameworks in which you were unpacking. I mean, all of this is to say, maybe could you speak a little more about how you've been thinking through this potential tension between a kind of interpretive unmasking relative to a kind of visual masking that's happening on the surface of the work itself?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. So this is part of the reason why I love Mutu's work, and why I also kind of just revel in being like a student of the way that she thinks as well. So she often talks about her, well, I read them as frustrations, but her various encounters with being critiqued in art school, right? And all of her critiques came back to the fact that she was an African woman, no matter what she created. And so one of the things that I started thinking about is the fact that when you are labeled as other, which essentially means if you are, not white and male, right, then everything goes back to the ways in which, you are othered, right? No matter what you create, no matter what you do, often comes back to that. And I think that kind of like head-on collisions with trying to displace those particular assumptions, I mean, they're maddeningly just, they don't work. And so I thought it was really interesting for her to, within the work itself, really play with the idea of performance, gender as performance, blackness as performance, exaggerated performance, right? Down to the gesture, down to clothing that her figures may or may not wear, down to skin color that they may or may not have, right? And sort of like, I think similar to, kind of like Monet, like depending on, if you're up close or if you're far away, you're picking up different kinds of things, the way that all the images come together. And I think that when you're up close thinking about the ways that all the logics of the images are stitched together to create this kind of like amalgamated being, you're really introduced to the notion that you have absolutely no idea how these images, create your assumptions of what a person is or isn't, or what a figure is or isn't. She also has sort of said, people always say that I'm talking about black women, but I could be talking about a purple insect, And so I don't like to, I use her work to think about the experiences of black women across the African diaspora, and I also use her work to think about our assumptions about the experience of women across the African diaspora and how they confront assumptions that they can't escape, that condition their lives, but the ways in which their practices and their performances of blackness, of femininity, really exceed logics that aim to contain, that aim to make, okay, I know what you are, I know what you're gonna say because I've seen what you look like, and I have a collection of experiences and stereotypes that have organized my social relationships. So boom, I'm gonna put you in this box and we're gonna have this conversation and that's what's gonna be it, right? So I think that there's a way that black feminine subjects particularly have navigated that, that kind of way of being in the world. And I think that her work really speaks to, kind of like a necessary ambivalence that comes with being in positions constantly where that is how your work and who you are is responded to. Thanks so much for that question.
Thanks. Thanks, Sonya, for a very provocative talk. Or it's provoked me anyway. I think that the idea of history and Avi Noam's plea for a richer idea, a more complicated idea of history, and how to put that together with the theme of the meeting, which is about ecology. How might these two things be put together? And it put me in mind of Riegel's famous essay in which he draws the distinctions. It's about monuments. It's about the sort of monuments that interest you, that you have a difference between age value and historical value. Age value is simply the traces of ruin, the traces of how the water has seeped through the sandstone and so on. And then you have historical value, where you have historians are always trying to fix something. When the date of this, the 12th century or the 9th century or whatever, trying to get it straight. And not only trying to get it straight, but building sheds over it so it doesn't age any further, and repainting it very carefully and attention to the original, in quotes, colors, rather than whatever colors might have been applied to it in the course of time. So you have here a dramatic example of the difference between age value and historical value. And I guess that it was Robert's talk that also put me in mind of how recent our idea of history is. It's not, in the case of the caves, it's only in the 1950s that there was a concerted effort to try to historicize the caves that you're dealing with. And in Robert's case, we have a long history of thinking about trying to get over the biblical account of how the world was shaped and so on and so forth. So this idea of history is really very recent with us. And so that put me in mind of us being the victims of history. We are the victims of history. We are the victims of this linear trajectory, which has accelerated out of our control. We are threatened with an ecological disaster because we are drunk on history. In other words, the progress, the notion that history might be going somewhere, that things are getting better and better all the time, more and more accumulation, all these cars and abandoned in the desert, cars from the 1950s or 1940s and so on. So we don't need them anymore, so let's just junk them, let's just throw them away. So in some senses we are the victims of this accelerated belief that history means something, that there's a meaningfulness to industrialization, to progress, to more and more televisions, more and more cars, more and more cell phones, and so on and so forth. That seems to me to strike me as a way of putting together the notion of ecology and the notion of history.
May I answer that, or trying to? Yes, of course. One thing I have to say that you're completely right. Dealing with this material as I do, what I did, doesn't give you any answer to the question. There are victims of history, especially human victims, human cultures and societies who are suffering up till now under our Western colonial history, and this history was not not rooted, but also had a kind of ideological background in this one background, in this conceptualizing or conception of how human history and natural history may hang together or may be linked, that I try to figure out one small piece of this. So, but there's no, there's one aspect, if we talk about possibilities of actions and not just possibilities but necessities of agency, then there have to be some steps of thinking and of finding more points from my point of view to really to come into productive discussion and maybe even common actions with people who are studying post-colonial problematics in a direct way. So that's one thing, but nevertheless, I think it is, and maybe I'm wrong with that as well, but doing art history, I think there is something like as critic theories thought that there might be in history, they say in German, uneingelöste Möglichkeiten means unrealized possibilities, and maybe within these possibilities history didn't realize, or we didn't realize in history, there may lay some starting points for alternative options. Maybe that's wrong, maybe to be active today doesn't have to do anything with these. Maybe this Adorno thing is a kind of typically German late romantic idea that there might be lay in history something which could be realized now as a kind of better option. So, but at the moment that's the trace I was following, or I'm following in this kind of reconstruction of hidden pieces in our own history as maybe some ingredients for recipes we have to brew for the future. But yes, that's.
Just very quickly to respond to your question. think to see the works that I'm talking about as victims of history, it depends on perspective. And that's why I say I want to do eco-art history as opposed to art history, because in some way I'm trying to escape this kind of linearity that's so ingrained in the way we do art history. And the model that I'm experimenting with is not just linear, but in fact it can be very abrupt juxtaposition. So when it's first made, as opposed to what's happening right now or a certain point in time. And one theme that I would like to bring out again and again is continuity. That I try to emphasize that, you know, it's the changes that we see is not just because it's all due to the modern condition, but in fact there are ways to connect these things from the past to the present. So I stress the use of the shelter, because people probably built those things probably in very similar shapes centuries ago. So there's a continuity in that. And it might not sound very sciencey or snazzy today that, you know, it's just a very simple shelter, but it actually works. And that matters. And so, so I want to bring this out as a way to counter the kind of presentist attitude that we often see in the climate change debate, that, you know, everything that we see today, it's very specific to now. And we try to victimize ourselves by thinking in these terms. So maybe I'm just shifting the emphasis. Maybe it works, maybe it does not work. I don't know.
I mean, I really like the idea of sort of critiquing the presentism of, like, you know, eco-theory right now, because just to go back to your question quickly about masks, you know, of course, I'm now thinking about, you know, Frantz Fanon and black skin, white masks, and sort of the ongoing violence of internalized, like, colonial oppression, right? And I think that one of the things that I'm, you know, trying to carefully chart is the ways that race and racism it's not necessarily, you know, kind of like white people and then like people of color being victimized constantly, right? Like, it's an organizing logic that it's an organizing, uncontained, excessive logic that comes out in all kinds of violent ways that force or that often encourage some figures who have been, again, already sort of like victimized by a particular colonial relationship to attack themselves, right? And by themselves, I also mean sort of like us as an extension of our, I hate the word surroundings, but surroundings, right? And our kind of like other non-human kin. And I think that without thinking about history and without thinking about the ways in which those kind of like legacies and modes of being that have deeply ingrained anti-Black colonial violence within like many Black cultural practices that continue to shape the world, then it's difficult to really understand how we're making sense of our earth ethics that don't just affect human bodies, right? But that go on and limit the way that we conceptualize sort of how to frame the problems that we're dealing with right now. And then of course the jump is like, how do we solve, you know, solve, and what do we do, and like how do we take action? But the intricacies of that damage are so under-conceptualized, right? And sort of like the ways in which anti-Blackness can mask, you know, a Black figure, or a Black body, which is already a sort of like tool or experiment in scientific reason, you know, continues to be obscured, right? So I was just thinking about that.
Well, thank you to our speakers, Sonya, Chelsea, and Robert, but we have been so animated that we are out of time. So we are headed to lunch now. We'll all convene again this afternoon, and we can continue our conversations then. So thank you so much, and thank you to you for your fantastic questions.